Hey guys, this is Smithy. Welcome to my channel. Today's video is a very special one. We're going to dupe another Huda Beauty palette, and this is the newest release, and this is called the Empowered Palette. Now this is the only big palette that she does towards the end of the year, every time I would say. Her bigger palettes are generally like this size, and this is the Mercury Retrograde palette. And it comes with 18 shades, and that's the exact same size and the number of shades that she's included in the Empowered palette too. And this retails for $67. Now this color story, as you can see, is pretty neutral and pretty warm tone leaning, I would say. It seems like there are two sections to this palette, one on the cool tone side and the other on the warm tone side, but I would say there's very less cool tone color story to it. I really expected that this is going to be like an half and half palette, which I would have loved, but this time Huda has experimented with a lot of formulas. So this time the palette has two hybrid eyeliner shadows, which are the two cream shadows on the left hand side, and then she has two high shine wet metallics, and then she has one crushed gold flake shadow and two powder metallics and 9 powder matte shadows. I love Huda's formulas. I generally love her shimmer shadows as well as the matte shades. It's very user friendly, very creamy. It's super blendable on the eyes. So I have no doubts that this palette is also going to be top notch quality. I personally would not buy this palette, and the only reason for that is I'm not more into yellow golds. When I look at these shades individually, it's a lot of repetitive shades that I have in my collection, and yellow golds I am not big keen. I don't wear those yellow golds. If again it was a pinky brown, a cool tone color story, I would have been loving it. I don't know how I feel about it. The cream shadows in the palette, which is open, I feel like the powder shadows are going to stick to it. It's going to make all messy. It just bothers me. That's the right word. It just bothers me. The gel shadow that she has, that balmy consistency, as well as those two cream shadows, which is the black and the brown. Those are the deepest shadows. Now I have watched several review videos, including Huda's video when she launched this palette. By the way, I don't know the date when she's launching this palette. I just know the details about the launch, and I'll link everything if I know before I post this in the description box below for you guys. But let's start duping. I would say, and give you a spoiler alert, in the beginning itself, if you do have these two eyeshadow palettes, you probably have a lot in your collection already from that palette. A few shades have been duped from here and there from the Red Dragon palette, a few individual shades that I have in my collection, but these two are the main star point. So if you do have these palettes, you can definitely create a similar color story. I also thought that the Natasha Denona Dream palette would be very close to it, but when I saw the swatches, my Dream palette is more pinky brown, my color story. That's a neutral cool tone. It definitely has warm tones too, but Huda's warm tones is orangey. Natasha's warm tone is more pinky leaning, if that makes sense. But I feel these two eyeshadow palettes would just give you the craving of those shades. So let's begin duping. I just came back from the church, so the eyeshadow that you're seeing on my lid is one of the eyeshadows. I'll get to it when I reach there, but I'll also do a look using these shadows towards the end of the video together. So let's begin. The first shadow in the palette is called Purpose, and this is the cream black shade of the palette. Now I'm gonna go row by row. I feel like that makes sense. I have a black cream shadow with me, so I'm just gonna swatch that, but any cream black shadow would do the job. This is from Hot Mess Rockins Cosmetics, and I just had a pack of these cream shadow sticks, so I'm just gonna swatch that, but there's nothing special to it. It's a beautiful blending cream black shadow. But I really feel if this was a powder shadow, even the other cream shadow, if that was a powder shadow, I feel that would be more user friendly to a lot more people. I don't tend to go for these like cream shadows, especially when I'm in a rush, I'm going to office, I don't want it to crease or anything like that. I am looking for like good blendable shadows. I don't want to get over the fuss of like putting the cream shadow and then setting it over the powder. Like I can just go with the powder shadow and just blend everything out. If that makes sense. I don't know. Is that high maintenance? I don't know. The second shade in the palette is called Courageous. And this is actually duped by my single shadow from Pretty for Your Face. And this is called Scorched. Now this is like a burgundy shade with a black base to it. Can you see that black base? It is like a deep burgundy shade, but it has like a black base to it and with a lot of like textured shimmers to it. So I felt like I could dupe this shadow, but the textural feel would not come if I use something else. So that's why I'm gonna swatch this. Again, this is Pretty for Your Face and the shade is called Scorched. And this exactly performs like that. Can you see that black base? If you blend this out, you could see that black base coming through. And that's exactly how like the Huda Beauty formula is also. But I'll also say that this shadow is more of like a duochrome, multichrome. So you would see like a purple shift also coming through with that burgundy shade. As you can see, can you see that burgundy on my finger? But you see purple on my hand, right? But it's truly like this burgundy in like real life. But it has like that black base to it. So yeah, I felt like this is like the closest that I can get. Okay, the next shade in the palette is called Limitless, and this has been duped by my Corderosa palette, and the shade is called Sun Sprite. This one, I feel like even textural wise and shade wise, this is like coming very, very close to it. Maybe this is like the gold flake shadow that she's talking about, or the other yellow gold. But nevertheless, like the shade wise, this is very, very close, I would say. So that is Sun Sprite from Corderosa palette, duping the shade Limitless. Let's move on to the next shade, and the next shade is called Confident. Now, out of the powder shadows, this is like the most deepest that she's getting to, and it is like a deep, rich burgundy shade, and I duped it with my Red Dragon palette from Odin's Eye, and the shade that I'm duping it with is this, which is called Fire. So let's watch that. There you go. And that is duping the shade Confident. The next shade in the palette is called Charisma, and this has been duped by my Chocolate Martini palette from Glamlight, and the shade is called Rich, this one. Now, if you do not have that Corderosa palette, the earlier shadow that we swatched, this golden shadow, it can be duped by this shade too from the Chocolate Martini palette. But I feel like that is a little more closer to it. This has that golden bronze to it. So this, I'm gonna swatch Rich for this because I feel like this is like an exact dupe. Even like textural wise, this is like a textured formula from Glamlight. Like really, really pretty. Now this dupes the shade called Charisma. Now the last shade in that row is called Keep Going, and this is being duped again by the Corderosa palette, and the shade is called Medallion, this warm tone brown shade. So let's watch that. Now I feel like this eyeshadow palette would have like a lot of like repeated shade, like a redundant shade, just with like a slight difference. Not that we needed all of these like warm tone shades and all of these like golden shades together, just because I don't think it gives like variety to like an 18 eyeshadow palette, you know? Yeah, that's just my opinion. But this is our first row swatched for you guys. Let's move on to the second row. I would give you like a close-up of all these shades together towards the end of duping all these swatches so that you can see the entire palette by itself. Okay, now in the second row, the first shade in that row is called Big Dreams, and this is basically duped by the Chocolate Martini palette, and the shade is called Girls Night Out. So let's watch that. This is like the cool tone shade in that palette, I would say. More of like a mauvey pinky brown shade, the shades that I absolutely love. So that's the shade that dupes the shade Big Dreams. Really pretty. Let's move on to the second shade. The next shade in the palette is called Manifested, and this is duped by the shade from the Corderosa palette, and the shade is called Campfire. Now this is more of a balmy consistency in the Huda's palette, but when you swatch it, this is exactly the shade that you get. So this is Campfire from Corderosa. The next shade in the palette is called Bold Moves, and this is the shade that actually grabbed my attention in the whole palette. And this shade is so textural, so dimensional, and the exact dupe to that shade is one of the shades from my JD Glow shadows, and this is called Hey Papi. Such a beautiful shade, so let's watch that. Very creamy and very dimensional. Oh my god, crazy. Look at that. So that dupes the shade called Bold Moves. The next shade in the palette is called Do It, and this is being duped by my Red Dragon palette from Odin's Eye, and the shade is called Amber. This one, it's mostly like a copper shimmer shade, and I feel like this tone is like absolutely exact to it. You do have like a similar shadow in Corderosa palette too, but there's definitely like a tone difference to it. So I wanted to swatch this. Again, this is Amber from Red Dragon. The next shade in the palette is called Power, and this is like a warm tone shade, but more of like a lighter tone shade, I would say. And this is being duped by my Corderosa palette, and the shade is called Apricot, this one. So let's watch that. These shadows are also like very, very comparable to the Huda Beauty matte shadows, just because it's like super creamy, super blendable, super buildable. Again, that dupes the shade Power. Now the next shadow in the palette is called Get It. Now this is actually, I can dupe it with this shadow, but I'll have to mix two shades together, and that would be Apricot and Summer Song together. But let's say if you do have like an orange shade, which I feel like my Spook palette from Gourmand Girls has like a perfect matte shadow comparable to that shade, and that is Haunted, this beautiful orange shade. When you swatch this, you get like a very, very similar shade to that. So I wanted to swatch that. And that dupes the shade called Get It. And that's the second row swatched for you guys. Now let's move on to the third row. The next shadow in the palette is called Worthy, and this is being duped by the shade called Bare Root from the Corderosa palette. Now this is a cream shadow in the Huda Beauty palette. So I am actually going to swatch a cream shadow. I'm actually going to swatch my M Cosmetics bronzer in the shade Nomadic, because this is such a similar shade to that. So I'm going to do that. There you go. But if you want like a powder version of it, Bare Root is a very, very, very close shade to it. So this dupes the shade called Worthy. Now the next shade in the palette is called Rebel, and this is being duped by my Chocolate Martini palette, and the shade that dupes it is called Syrup. This warm tone, like a deeper, like a orangey brown with like a hint of like pink in it. So let's swatch that. There you go. And that dupes the shade called Rebel. The next shadow in the palette is called Winner, and this is like the gray shadow in the palette, and this is being duped by my Sultry palette, and the shade that I'm duping it with is called Twig. So let's watch that. So that dupes the shade called Winner. The next shadow in the palette is called Visionary, and this is more like a burgundy shade, but in like a, I feel like this is the other cream shade shimmer in the palette, and this is being duped by the shade called Dark Night from the Corda Rosa palette. So let's watch this. There you go. The next shade in the palette is called Best Self, and this is duped by the Red Dragon palette from Odin's Eye again. And the shade that dupes it is called Serene, this one. And this is the shadow that I have all over my eyelid right now. Just because I went to church, I had to put something. So I thought like one shadow will do the job. And then I can build on top of it with the other shadows to show you the look. So again, this is Serene from Odin's Eye Red Dragon palette. It's definitely more on the peachy orangey side. But let's say if you do not have the Odin's Eye palette, a very similar shade to that I would say would be Hybrid from the Corda Rosa palette. So do keep that in mind. And the last shade in the palette is called Legacy, and this is like the warm tone orangey brown shade, and this is being duped by again from the Corda Rosa palette, and the shade is called Summer Song, this one. So let's watch that. Too many warm tone shades for me, I would say. There you go. Now this is the final row of that palette. Now let me show you a close-up of all the swatches so that you can see it for yourself how the entire palette looks all in its glory and how the color story is, so that you can decide for yourself whether you need this palette in your collection or not, or if you do have these palettes that I told you about in your collection, do you want to skip it this time just like me? So yes, now let's move on to creating the eye look using this palette. Ignore whatever I have on my eyes. I'm just going to intensify it with the same shade. So I'm going to take Serene and I'm just putting it all across my crease, just building it up because I just had like a light wash of this shade earlier. And I'm going to take the same shade on my lower lash line too. Let's dip into Corda Rosa palette. And I'm going to take the shade called Summer Song and I'm going to put that on my outer corners. And just blend it into my crease shade that we just laid down. And if we mess up the eyeliner that we have applied, we can just re-intensify it later. You know I don't go outside without an eyeliner, right? So ignore. Ignore all those steps. I'm also going to take the same shade on the outer corners of the lower lash line. I'm going to take the shade Medallion from the same palette and just blend the edges of this Summer Song shade. And then for the extreme outer corners, we're going to dip back into the Red Dragon palette and to the shade called Fire, this burgundy shade. I'm going to take that very close to the lower lash line just to deepen everything out, just like that. And I'm also going to take the same shade on the extreme outer corner of my eye. Just like that. And just flick it into that orangey shade that we applied, the Summer Song shade. And this would give a tiny little bit of depth in our eye look. I'm going to go back to that Summer Song shade and then just blend out the edges and just dip it into the crease. Just a tiny little bit. I don't want to lose that orange and that you know, the warm toneness of this palette. And then just blend everything out with a big fluffy brush. And you can just leave it at that. But this palette is not complete without its shimmers. So we're going to apply that. I'm going to first start with the shade Amber, which is like that coppery shade. And just apply it right in the center of my eyelid. It's that coppery, shimmery shade. Right in the center, just because I'm going to apply that gold shade in the inner third. I love this Odin's Eye palette shimmers. Like even the mattes, I just love them so much. It's so sparkly, so dimensional, so ethereal. Really love them. So once you have this shade all laid down, I'm going to dip into my Chocolate Martini palette into the shade Rich, because this is like the standout shade of that palette, so I have to use it. I'm going to take that on my inner corner of my eye and just melt it down with that coppery shade. I'm going to take a smaller definer brush for my inner corners, just like that, and just match it together. I'm just going to blend everything out with that deepening brush that we used. With no extra product to it, I'm just going to blend the edges. And that's all for the eye look. I'm going to finish off this eye with some liner and mascara, and I'll get right back. And that's my final eye look. I really hope that you guys enjoyed the whole duping video that I did for you guys. Duping the newest Huda palette, which is the Empowered palette. Let me know in the comment section below, are you interested in picking this palette out, or are you going to skip it out for this time? But that's all for today, guys. I really hope that this video was helpful for you guys. If you did like this video, do give it a thumbs up and also subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so that you're notified every time that I post next. I generally upload 3 videos every single week, sometimes 4, which is like the recent holiday season like trend, I would say. But generally on Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays at 9 AM Eastern Standard Time. Until next time, I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye guys.